My phone buzzed twice against the workbench, and I almost didn't look. I had a chisel in my hand and 8 more mortises to clean before the light went, and my phone buzzes 40 times a day with nothing in it that matters. But the third buzz came fast on the second, the way a group text does when everyone is typing at once, and something in my hands already knew before my head did. I set the chisel down flat, the way you set down a tool you might need again in about 10 seconds, and I picked up the phone. A wedding coordinator named Nora Fitch had added me to a message thread meant for caterers, florists, and a tent company out of Lancaster. Somebody's assistant had typed my name into the wrong box, the way names get typed in wrong when nobody stops to check them twice. The subject line said Ashworth Wedding, Sycamore Hollow. Under it was a delivery schedule with a date 6 weeks out, and under that, a line about generator placement near the hayloft door. My hayloft door, the one I'd rehung myself 2 winters back, plumbed it twice because the old header had dropped an inch on the north end. I read it standing up, both hands still smelling like linseed oil, and I read it a second time to make sure I hadn't gotten it backward. I hadn't. My mother had booked my sister's wedding inside the barn I had spent 5 years bringing back from a county condemnation notice, and she had done it without a single word to me. Not a call, not a text, not a question asked in passing at Sunday dinner. She had simply gone ahead. The way you go ahead with something you have already decided belongs to you and only needs your say-so to move. I stood there a long minute with the phone still lit in my hand, scrolling back up through the thread to see how far along it already was. Deposits paid, a tasting scheduled, a rental company confirming 140 chairs, white folding, delivered the Thursday before. Somewhere in that thread was a version of my life that had already been decided for me, laid out in line items, and I hadn't been asked a single question about any of it. I remember looking down at my own hands, at the calluses across both palms from 5 years of chisel handles and mallet grips. Not one person in my family had ever once asked what those hands had cost me. I want to tell you now, before I tell you anything else, what came of that message. 12 days before that wedding was supposed to happen, I sold that land out from under all of them. I signed the papers in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning. By the time anyone in my family understood what I had done, the tent company had already been turned back at the gate. I am not going to pretend that was an easy thing to live with, because it was not. I knew exactly what it would cost my sister on her wedding day, and I did it anyway. But to understand why, you have to go back 5 years. You have to go back to a barn with half its roof open to the sky. You have to see a woman standing in the wreckage of it, not yet ready to admit how much she needed something to belong to her, and only her, for once in her life. My name is Delia Ashworth. I restore old timber frames for a living, the kind of barns and homesteads most people drive past without a second look. For 5 years, every free hour I had went into one particular building on a piece of ground called Sycamore Hollow, and I never once thought I would be the one to sell it. My grandfather, Walter Ashworth, died 6 years ago this past spring. He left Sycamore Hollow to my sister Whitney and me in equal shares, through a trust he had spent the last years of his life quietly rewriting. He never told either of us he was doing it. He just did it, the way he did most things, alone at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee gone cold. None of us knew the shape of what he had built until the lawyer read it out loud after the funeral. 82 acres, and on it, a bank barn built in 1861 by a man named Josiah Ashworth, 3 generations back. It had stood through everything a barn stands through, storms and neglect and 1 bad decade of my grandfather's health when nobody had the time or the money to keep it up. By the time he died, the county had already sent a letter, unsafe structure. It said, recommend condemnation. The letter was still sitting on the kitchen counter of the farmhouse when we cleared it out, unopened, because he had not wanted to look at it. I was the one who opened it. I sat in my truck in the farmhouse driveway and read it twice. Something in me went very still, the way it does right before you decide something big without quite admitting to yourself that you have decided it. I had spent every summer of my childhood in that barn. I knew the smell of it, hay dust and old cedar and the particular cold that lived in the stone foundation even in August. I was not going to be the one who let it come down. Whitney did not feel the same pull. And I want to be fair about that, because it is not a crime to love a place differently than someone else loves it. She came out to Sycamore Hollow twice in that first year, both times for photographs, both times gone again within the hour. She said the light was beautiful there for pictures. She never once picked up a tool, and I never once asked her to. That was its own kind of quiet arrangement between us. The one where I did the work and she admired the result from a safe distance. And for a long time I told myself I was fine with it. I started restoring the frame that same summer. I am a timber framer by trade, which means I make my living reading old wood the way other people rid a room. I knew within the first week that the barn could be saved, but only if somebody was willing to do it slow, joint by joint, instead of tearing the whole frame out and starting fresh with lumber that carried no history in it. I told my mother my plan over dinner one Sunday, expecting some kind of argument about money or time or sense. What I got instead was a shrug and a comment about how I had always been the one who liked projects. That was the whole conversation. My mother, Carol, has never once in her life asked me a follow-up question about anything I have built. I used to think that was just her way, quiet and a little distracted, until I came to understand it as something closer to a policy. She asks Whitney about her plans and never lets the subject drop for the rest of an evening. She has asked me over 5 years whether a job was almost done. She has never once asked me how it was going while I was still in the middle of it. The first night I slept out there, the roof was still open in 2 places, tarped over with blue poly sheeting that snapped in the wind all night like something trying to get loose. I lay on a cot in what used to be the haymow and listened to that sound. I thought about my grandfather sitting at his kitchen table, writing something into that trust that none of us had read yet. The lawyer had mentioned an article 7 in passing at the reading, something about the barn parcel specifically, and moved on before I thought to ask what it meant. I did not think about it again for years. I had no idea, that first night, how much of my life would eventually turn on 4 words I had not bothered to read. I fell asleep counting the seams in the roof tarp, the way you count anything to keep from thinking too hard about how alone you are in a decision nobody else in your family has agreed to share. 5 years is a strange length of time to measure against a building. It is long enough that you forget who you were when you started. In my case, it meant $146,000. Most of it was my own money. Some of it was a small business loan I took out against my workshop equipment, because the roof timbers alone came to more than I had saved in 3 years of trying. It meant every Saturday and most Sundays. It meant every vacation week I did not spend visiting anyone. It meant every bonus check from a paying job routed straight into lumber and hardware instead of anything for myself. The ordinary comforts other people my age were buying without a second thought. I did not resent $1 of it while I was spending it. I want that understood, because what came later was never about the money. It was about being asked. I did not do the work alone. In my second year out there, I brought on Gus Pruitt, a timber framer twice my age who had trained the man who trained me, and who still cut every joint by hand when the wood allowed it. Gus keeps a ledger for every job he touches, a plain composition notebook, one per house or barn, filled with dates and material costs and who decided what and when. It is not a habit he picked up for any legal reason. It is just how his mind works. The same way some men keep a fishing log. He started one for Sycamore Hollow the week he came on, without my asking, and more than once I teased him about it. He always said the same thing back. Paper remembers what people decide to forget. Twice in those 5 years, A company called Iron Bridge Steel and Fabrication reached out about the land. Their plant sits 4 miles from Sycamore Hollow, off the state road, and they had been trying to buy frontage acreage in that corridor for a logistics yard. The first offer came in my 3rd year, respectable but not enough to turn my head. The second came the following spring, higher, delivered by a woman named Priya Sandoval, who drove out herself instead of sending a letter, which told me they meant it. I turned her down over coffee in my truck, and I remember exactly what I told her. I said I was not in the business of selling something I had not finished building. She nodded like she had heard that answer before, from someone, somewhere, and left her card on the dash anyway. I think about that conversation often now, because I meant every word of it at the time. I was not being noble. I simply could not picture handing that barn to anyone who would look at 82 acres and see square footage instead of history. Gus was there both times Iron Bridge came around, standing off to one side with his arms crossed, saying nothing until they had gone. Then he would go back to whatever he was cutting and say something like, "One of these days that ledger of mine is going to save somebody's neck." I never asked whose neck he meant. I assumed he meant mine, in some argument with a building inspector or a supplier who tried to short-change us on lumber grade. I did not think back then that the neck in question would belong to my own mother. My family visited Sycamore Hollow rarely during those years, and when they did, it was never to see the work. Whitney came for photographs, as I said. My mother came exactly twice, both times for something else entirely. A family gathering she wanted held somewhere scenic. Both times she left before I finished showing her what we had done that season. She would look at a wall I had spent 3 weekends rechinking and say it looked nice, the same tone she used for a store display. It was the kind of compliment you give a stranger's living room and forget by the time you reach your car. I stopped expecting more than that fairly early on. I told myself the work was its own reward, and most days, out there alone with a mallet in my hand and Gus humming some tune from his own youth, it genuinely was. There was a particular Sunday in the 4th year I still think about. I called my mother to tell her we had finally closed in the roof for good. No more tarps, no more listening for rain in the night. She asked if that meant I would finally have weekends free again. I told her I did not think so, that there was still the whole interior to finish. She said, "Well, that's you all over," and changed the subject to a dress Whitney had found for some event I had not been invited to. I hung up the phone and went back out to the barn and worked until it was too dark to see the chalk lines on the floor. I drove out to Sycamore Hollow within the hour of reading that message thread, because I needed to see it with my own eyes before I let myself believe it. The gravel lane still runs the same way it always has. Past the old fence line, I reset myself in the 2nd year, and I could see the trucks before I even made the turn. A rental company van, a flatbed with folding tables stacked on it. 2 men in matching polo shirts standing at the base of the hay loft, one of them holding a cordless drill. I got out of my truck slower than I wanted to. I watched the man with the drill set a lag bolt straight into the face of a post and beam joint I had cut by hand in my 2nd year. It was a joint I remembered cutting because I had gotten it wrong twice before I got it right, and I had been proud of it every time I walked past it since. He was hanging a string of cafe lights off it, drilling straight through wood that had never once had a nail or a screw driven into its face in 165 years of standing. He had no idea what he was driving a bolt into. He had no reason to know. That was not his failure. It was mine, for not being the one who told him to stop. I stood there long enough to feel the specific kind of sick that comes from watching something you built get treated like it belongs to nobody in particular. My hands wanted a tool. There was nothing for them to hold. I did tell him to stop, in the end, but quietly, and I asked him whose crew he was working for. He said the mother of the bride had walked the site with them the week before and signed off on the whole layout herself. I thanked him, and I walked back to my truck, and I called my mother from the driver's seat with the door still open and one boot on the running board. She picked up on the 3rd ring, sounding pleased, the way she sounds when she assumes a call is good news. I asked her as evenly as I could manage whether she had booked Whitney's wedding at Sycamore Hollow without telling me. There was a pause, but not a guilty one. It was the pause of someone recalculating how to explain something obvious to a person being difficult about it. It's family land. Honey, she said. I didn't think I needed permission. It's not like I was booking someone else's backyard. I asked her if she understood that I owned half of that land and had put 5 years of my own money and my own hands into every board of that barn. She said she understood I had done a lot of work out there and that everyone appreciated it, and that this was exactly why it made sense to hold the wedding somewhere so meaningful to the family. She used the word family 4 times in under a minute. I counted, the way you count something to keep your voice level. I asked her a second time, plainly, whether she had thought to ask me before she signed anything. There was a small silence, and then she laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at a question you think is beside the point. Delia, she said, it's a barn. I did not correct her. I texted Whitney next, because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted to believe she had not known that this was entirely our mother's doing, and my sister would be as surprised as I was. Whitney wrote back inside of a minute, "You're always so sensitive about that barn." It read, "It's one day. D. Can you please not make this into something?" I sat in my truck a long while after that. Engine off, hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the way you sit when you are giving yourself a minute to decide whether to say something you cannot take back. I did not call either of them again that day. I drove home instead. I went into the drawer in my workshop where I keep paperwork I do not look at often. Underneath the warranty cards and the old invoices, I found the folder from the trust reading, still in its original envelope from the lawyer's office. I had never opened the section past the first 2 pages. I remember standing there in the workshop light with that envelope in my hand, feeling something close to relief. The particular relief of realizing a door you never noticed was still unlocked. I called Warren Colby's office before I had even finished reading the cover letter, and I asked his assistant if he had time to see me that week. She said he had an opening the next morning. I told her I would take it. Warren Colby's office sits above a hardware store on the square in Hollow Creek, up a narrow staircase that creaks on the 4th step no matter how carefully you climb it. He has managed the Ashworth Family Trust since before my grandfather died, and he greeted me the way he always does, by my first name, with a coffee already poured before I sat down. I had the envelope in my lap before he even asked why I had come. He read the cover letter first. The general summary he assumed I already knew. And then he turned to the section I had skipped 5 years ago. Article 7, he said, more to himself than to me. And something in his face changed, the look of a man remembering a conversation he had been waiting a long time to have. He turned the folder around so I could read it myself. The language was plainer than I expected. Either beneficiary of the Sycamore Hollow Barn parcel may, at any time, by written notice to the trustee, purchase the other beneficiary's undivided interest in that parcel. The price would be set by independent appraisal, not by anyone's opinion of what the place was worth. I read it twice, then a 3rd time, tracing the words with one finger the way I trace a measurement I do not quite trust yet. I asked Warren what it meant in practice, whether it was really as simple as it sounded on the page. "It is exactly as simple as it sounds," he said. "You notify me in writing. We hire an independent appraiser, someone with no connection to either side of the family. Whatever number they return, you pay your sister half of it, and the parcel becomes entirely yours. No one else's consent is required, not your mother's, not your sister's." I asked him why my grandfather had written something so specific into a trust that otherwise treated Whitney and me exactly the same in every other respect. Warren set the folder down and was quiet for a moment before he answered. "He told me about a summer years before I was old enough to remember it clearly. My grandfather had caught my mother rearranging which of her daughters got which chores around the farm. The harder, dirtier work always went to me. The visible work, the kind that photographed well, always went to Whitney. Walter never said a word about it to my mother directly. Warren told me, but he mentioned it once, not long before he died, while we were drafting this very section. He said he had watched it happen for 30 years, and he was tired of waiting for somebody in this family to notice on their own. He wanted whichever one of you actually took care of the place to be able to keep it, Warren said, quoting him almost exactly, no matter what anybody else in the family decided to do around her. I sat with that for a long moment. It was strange, hearing a dead man's private judgment of his own daughter spoken out loud in a lawyer's office. It was stranger still to realize he had seen this exact moment coming. Decades before I was even born into the family he was worried about protecting. Warren asked if I wanted to proceed. He told me plainly what it would cost, in time and in money. Once I filed the written note, he said, I could not undo it without Whitney's agreement. And he doubted I would get that easily. I told him I understood. He looked at me for a moment longer than the question required. Are you sure this is what you want? He asked. Not the land. This, doing it before the wedding, not after. I did not answer him right away. I sat there with the folder open on the desk between us. My grandfather's handwriting was nowhere on the page, but somehow he was present in every clause of it anyway. I thought about the cafe lights strung through my hayloft door for a wedding I had not been asked about. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone, easy and untroubled, telling me it was family land, as though that settled something rather than opened it wide. And I thought about a woman standing in a roofless barn 5 years ago. She had promised herself, without quite saying it out loud, that she would never again let someone else decide what her own 2 hands were worth. I did not answer Warren that afternoon. I told him I needed a few days. He nodded like he had expected exactly that, and told me the offer to file would still be there whenever I was ready. I drove home with the folder on the seat beside me, and I did not touch the radio the whole way back. I filed the written notice 4 days later. I did not tell Whitney or my mother beforehand. Warren had advised against it, and I already knew, from 5 years of small conversations that went nowhere, exactly how that call would go. I mailed the notice myself, certified at the post office in Hollow Creek. I stood at the counter and watched the clerk stamp it. This was the quietest, least dramatic thing I had ever done, and it was about to change the most. The independent appraiser came out to Sycamore Hollow 11 days later. His name was Dale Pruitt, no relation to Gus as far as either of them could work out. He walked every room of the barn with a clipboard, asking detailed questions about roof age and foundation repair, and I answered every one of them without embellishing anything. His report came back 2 weeks after that. $460,000 for the full 82 acres. Barn included. He had based it on comparable agricultural land in the area, and on the cost of the restoration work already completed. Half of that came to $230,000. I paid it out of a second loan against my workshop, and out of savings I had been setting aside for a retirement I had not thought much about yet. Whitney's share of Sycamore Hollow became mine, transferred through Warren's office. The formality of it felt almost anticlimactic, given everything that had led up to it. I sat in Warren's office afterward for a minute longer than I needed to, just looking at my own name, alone, on the deed line where 2 names had always been before. I did not receive a call from my sister that day. I did not expect one, and I told myself that not expecting it did not mean it failed to sting. What I had not planned on was Priya Sandoval calling again, 3 days after the transfer closed. Ironbridge Steel and Fabrication was still expanding. They were still looking for frontage acreage on that stretch of the state road. She told me she had heard, through channels I did not ask about, that the ownership situation out at Sycamore Hollow had changed. Then she named a figure, $1,150,000 for the entire parcel. That was well above anything an agricultural appraisal would ever return. Industrial buyers pay for access to a road. They do not pay for the sentimental value of a barn. I told her I would call her back, and I meant it as a genuine maybe, not a formality. That surprised me more than it should have. I sat with the number for 2 full days. I worked in the barn the whole time, running my hand along joints I had cut myself. In years I could still name by the ache in a particular shoulder, or the memory of a particular winter. I thought about opening the barn someday to teach the kind of joinery nobody teaches anymore. I thought about my grandfather's kitchen table. I tried to picture the version of this land he must have imagined when he wrote Article 7, a version where the barn stayed whole in the family, handed down to somebody who loved it the way he had. I also thought about a string of cafe lights, drilled straight into a beam I had cut with my own hands, hung there without a single question asked of me first. I thought about family land, honey, said in a voice that assumed I would always, eventually, say yes to whatever the family needed from me. I thought about 16 years, if I let myself count forward, of that same voice assuming the same thing about whatever I built next. On the second night, I called Priya back and told her I would sell. She asked if I wanted a few more days to think it over, the way people do when they expect you to change your mind. I told her I did not need them. Before I signed anything, I asked Gus to help me pull one beam out of the hayloft. It was the original summer beam, hand-hewn by Josiah Ashworth in 1861, the one everything else in that loft had been framed around for 165 years. It took the two of us most of an afternoon. We worked carefully so as not to crack it, lowering it down on ropes the way you lower something you intend to keep for the rest of your life. Gus did not ask me why. He just worked, the way he always does. When we finally got it flat in the bed of my truck, he put one hand on it. "This part of the place at least gets to come with you," he said. The closing was scheduled for 12 days before Whitney's wedding. I told no one in my family. I went home that night and stood in my own driveway for a long time, looking at that beam under a tarp in the truck bed. And I let myself feel, for the first time since I had opened that group text, something closer to grief than anger. The closing took place in Warren's office on a Tuesday morning, 12 days before the wedding. It was, in every practical sense, the least dramatic hour of this entire story. Priya Sandoval brought a colleague from Ironbridge's legal department, a quiet young man who barely spoke except to confirm figures. Warren had the deed and the settlement statement laid out in neat stacks. I signed my name in 6 places. Priya signed in 6 more. Somewhere in the middle of that ordinary paperwork, 82 acres that my family had held for 4 generations became the property of a steel fabrication company. A logistics yard was already drafted for the frontage, penciled onto a site plan I glimpsed once, upside down, on the corner of Priya's colleague's folder. Gus came with me, not because he had any role in the transaction, but because I had asked him to. I did not think I could sit through it without somebody in the room who understood exactly what that land had cost me. Near the end, Warren asked if there was anything else for the file. Gus set his job ledger on the desk without a word. Every material cost, every date, every decision made about that barn for 5 years. All of it now part of the official record. The same notebook he had once joked would save somebody's neck. It never occurred to me, watching him hand it over, that it would end up saving mine in a very different room, less than 2 weeks later. I drove home from that closing feeling strange in a way I had not expected. I was not triumphant. I was not relieved. Mostly I was just quiet, the way you feel after a long job, when the last tool finally goes back on its hook and the shop goes silent around you. I did not call my mother. I did not call Whitney. There was nothing left for me to say to either of them that the paperwork was not already saying on my behalf. I kept expecting the silence in my own truck to feel like victory, and it never quite did. It felt more like the hour after a funeral, when the last car pulls out of the driveway and you are finally entirely alone with what happened. While all of that was happening, my sister was choosing between 2 cake flavors at a bakery in town. My mother was walking a florist through a color scheme built around the wildflowers that grow along the fence line at Sycamore Hollow in early summer. I know this because Whitney posted about it. Cheerful captions under photographs of ribbon samples and seating charts. 140 names already assigned to tables. She tagged the venue in every post. Sycamore Hollow Barn. It read. Those were the same words I had painted onto a small cedar sign and hung by the front door myself. 3 years earlier, back when I still believed that sign was announcing something we all shared. There is a particular kind of loneliness in watching people plan a celebration on ground you have already quietly signed away. They had no idea. I was the only one who did. I did not enjoy carrying that alone, and I want to be honest about it. There is a version of this story where I tell you I felt nothing but a clean, satisfying certainty the whole time. That would not be true. I felt sick some mornings. I felt sure other mornings. Mostly I felt like a woman standing very still in the middle of a room, waiting for a piece of furniture to fall that everyone else in the house still believed was bolted to the wall. The night before the wedding, I could not sleep. I stood at my kitchen window a long while, looking out toward the state road in the general direction of land that was no longer mine to look at with any claim at all. My hands still smelled faintly of the linseed oil I had rubbed into the salvaged beam that afternoon, laid across 2 sawhorses in my own new workshop, waiting for a foundation that did not exist yet. Somewhere out there, survey stakes had already gone in along the new property line. Somewhere out there, a barn I had loved back from the edge of collapse was standing in the dark, waiting for a morning that would not go the way anyone but me expected it to. I did not know, standing at that window, exactly how it would unfold once the sun came up. I only knew that in a few hours, 140 people were going to drive out to Sycamore Hollow expecting a wedding. Instead, they were going to find out, all at once, standing in front of each other, exactly what my family had never once thought to ask me. The first cars started turning down the gravel lane at 9 in the morning, 3 hours ahead of the ceremony. The way people arrive early for a wedding, they do not want to miss a minute of. I was not there to see the first ones stop. Gus told me about it afterward, because Gus was there, standing off to the side near the mailbox the way he always stands at the edge of things, watching. Where the old fence gate used to swing open onto the yard, there was now a length of temporary chain link and a sign zip-tied to the center post in plain black letters. Private property. No trespassing, Iron Bridge Steel and Fabrication. Survey stakes ran the new property line all the way down to the state road. Orange ribbon snapping in the same wind that used to snap my roof tarps years ago. The catering van pulled up behind a line of confused guests and idled there a long while before turning around. The driver told the coordinator, Nora Fitch, that his insurance would not cover a delivery onto an active industrial site. There was nothing anyone standing at that gate could say to change his mind. My mother arrived not long after, in her good dress, carrying a small speaker she had brought for exactly this kind of emergency, the kind she assumed she could still talk her way through. She climbed onto the tailgate of somebody's truck and raised her voice over the confusion. It was the same voice she has used at every family gathering I can remember. Smooth and certain. Built for smoothing things over before anyone could look at them too closely. I know there's been some kind of mix-up, she said. I promise you, it is nothing that can't be sorted out this morning. This is still family land, and we are still having a wedding. She had not finished the sentence before a man in a reflective vest walked up from the direction of the plant access road, radio clipped to his shoulder. He asked politely but without hesitation whether she understood the property had changed hands 12 days earlier. "Ma'am," he said, "I've got a closing date and a deed number if you need to see them. This whole parcel belongs to Ironbridge now." My mother's certainty did not leave her face all at once. It left in pieces, the way a wall loses paint, one flake and then another, and then a whole section coming down at once. That was when I walked up through the gate myself, on foot, past the chain link, past the stakes, with Warren Colby beside me and Gus's ledger in a folder under my arm. I had parked my truck a little way down the state road that morning, and waited there on purpose, watching the whole thing unfold from a distance before I let myself be seen. I did not raise my voice when I finally did walk in. I did not need to. I had spent 5 years learning that the loudest person in a room is rarely the one anybody remembers believing. My mother turned toward me first. "Delia," she said, "what did you do?" It was not really a question. It was an accusation dressed up as one. The same tone she has used on me my whole life whenever something inconvenient happened to be true. Warren stepped forward before I had to. He set the folder down on the tailgate she was still half standing on. It was open to the deed transfer, and to my grandfather's original signature at the bottom of Article 7. Anyone who wanted proof did not have to take my word for any of it, I told her, plainly, in front of everyone standing close enough to hear exactly what I had done. My grandfather had written a right into his trust 6 years ago. I had bought out Whitney's share of that land in full, using that right, entirely within the law. I had sold the whole parcel to Ironbridge 12 days before this morning. I had done it because nobody in this family had ever once asked me whether they could use what I had spent 5 years building with my own hands. Whitney came off the porch steps of the farmhouse then, still in her robe, her hair half done, and she was not calm the way I had been. "You have always been jealous of the fact that people actually notice what I do," she said, her voice climbing on every word. "This barn has been part of my business for 2 years. Half my styling portfolio is shot right here. You couldn't even give me one single day, without making it about yourself." She got to the end of that sentence and heard it, I think, about half a second too late. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a woman near the fence, someone from Trent's side of the family I did not recognize, said quietly to the person next to her, "Wait, isn't that the barn from her signature venue photos?" I thought that was hers. My mother turned on Whitney before I had to say another word. "You have been using your sister's barn for your business, and never once paid her a dime for it," she said, and for the first time all morning, her voice had nothing smooth left in it. Whitney did not answer that. Nobody had to answer it for her. It came apart on its own, right there between the chain-link fence and the folding chairs nobody would ever sit in. And I stood where I was and let it. Whitney's wedding happened 3 weeks later than planned, in a rented banquet hall off the highway outside Hollow Creek, with a guest list cut down by more than half. I was not invited, which did not surprise me, and which I did not, if I am honest, especially mind. My mother lost her seat on the flower committee at church that same month. Nobody voted her off it in any formal way. Her name simply did not appear on the next schedule posted in the vestibule, and nobody asked why, and nobody explained. Ironbridge broke ground on the logistics yard in August. I drove past it once, on my way to a job outside town, and I made myself look at it directly instead of glancing away the way I wanted to. Where the barn used to stand, there was a graded pad and a row of steel columns going up in a straight, efficient line. I felt the loss of it the way you feel any old wound on a cold morning, present but no longer sharp enough to stop you walking. I bought 6 acres of my own that same summer, a smaller piece of ground on the far side of the county, with a clear southern exposure and no history attached to it that belonged to anyone but me. I started a workshop there in September, and framed it myself over 4 weekends. When it came time to set the ridge, I brought in the beam Gus and I had carried out of the hay loft. It was hand-hewn by Josiah Ashworth in 1861, still bearing the adze marks of a man who had shaped it with his own 2 arms. 165 years before I was born. It did not fit the new building without alteration. I had known it would not, and I did the work myself, on a Saturday, alone, cutting 2 feet off each end and squaring the new joints by hand. Gus offered to help, and I told him I needed to do this part on my own, and he understood well enough not to argue. When I finally hoisted it into place, it sat exactly where I had cut it to sit, level, solid, sized to the building I had actually built. Instead of the one somebody else had already decided I belonged in, I stood underneath it a long while that evening, one hand flat against the old, dark wood. I could feel the same grain I had felt as a girl in my grandfather's haymow. A house, or a barn, or a workshop, I thought, is never really about the wood at all. It is about who gets asked before the first nail goes in, and who does not. There is a fresh mortise gauge on my new workbench now. Still smelling faintly of the oil I wiped it down with last night, set out for a job that is entirely my own. Everything in this shop sits exactly where my own 2 hands put it. For the first time in longer than I can remember, no one has to ask my permission to notice that.